Based on a series of 2 OAVs, itself adapted from a manga, Natsuki Crisis Battle was turned into a video game in 1995 by the studio TOS, known for having developed Super Tennis and, more interestingly in this case, the Super Butoden. The story centers on Natsuki, a martial arts enthusiast and member of her school's karate club, whose life is turned upside down by her encounter with Rina, a new student who shares her love for martial arts. Beautiful, generous, and full of life, Natsuki is irritating, and one day, they are attacked by mysterious men, a gang of tough thugs who are not joking around at all. Girls, scoundrels, and brawls, what more could you ask for? A quality game? Well. After a dynamically cut introduction, we access a quite comprehensive menu, consisting of a story mode, versus, haiku, and edit. Options allow choosing the difficulty level, remapping buttons, and listening to the sound test. 2 elements strike the player when discovering Natsuki Crisis Battle: the small size of the sprites and the low screen resolution characterized by 2 black bands. It's true that TOS's title does not match the image of an end-of-generation game, recalling that it was released in 1995, as everything appears modest, even grumpy. However, the level of detail in the graphics is not ridiculous, whether in how characters and settings are represented, though it's uneven in the latter case. Some backgrounds are quite pretty and exotic, transporting players to typically Japanese environments. The game's fidelity to the anime in this aspect is commendable. Unfortunately, the character animation doesn't really save the graphic representation, as the fighters are poorly animated. The judicious choice of keyframes does not compensate for the too few frames, resulting in choppy, not very aesthetic animations. It's a shame because the rest, the moves, inspired by real martial arts like Kyokushinkan, wrestling, or Jiu-Jitsu, are quite stylish. Another complaint is that the backgrounds lack life. With the exception of a disco stage or a warehouse shrouded in mist, most settings appear quite dull. Natsuki Crisis Battle's soundtrack may divide opinions. Many of its tracks are marked by a bit of a cheap and shrill electric guitar background, typical of the SNES's sound when it tries to reproduce realistic sounds. That said, I find them quite dynamic and in tune with the action on screen, in a 90s anime style. Also notable is the presence of fairly successful digital vocals, even if some may become annoying after a while. The sound effects of the hits are satisfying. The controls of Natsuki Crisis Battle rely on 4 buttons: weak punch, strong punch, weak kick, strong kick. Added to this are the L and R buttons for forward dash and backward dash, key elements for dodging attacks and launching quick counterattacks. A few minutes of play are enough to understand that Natsuki Crisis Battle is a game with old-school gameplay. Forget about infinite combos, juggles, or cancels. Angel's title favors an ultra-rigorous approach, focused almost exclusively on counters, positioning, and timing. Naturally, don't expect a balanced roster. In fact, it's unlikely you'd consider playing it in versus mode. However, the game remains interesting, with a more sophisticated system than it appears, including a well-designed counter mechanism and interesting desperate moves based on a fatigue gauge. After a few fights, one starts to have fun, trying to read the opponent's game and understanding the timings to land hits against an AI that's not as stupid as it seems. In 1995, offering a roster of 8 fighters was really shameful, even if we can commend the variety of their styles. Remember, SSF2 had already been released. Fortunately, the story mode, following the plot of the anime, turns out to be well designed, integrating cutscenes and successful little staging. It's the ideal mode to get used to the game, especially since all special moves won't be accessible from the start. Also commendable is the presence of a haiku mode, similar to a survival mode, which, as its name suggests, invites you to face 100 fighters in the purest tradition of karate. Finally, an original edit mode allows you to create your own special move, using the different animation steps of the fighters. Nice. As one can understand, the game's longevity will be as long as your interest in the manga or anime it is inspired by.
Versus
In 1994, at the height of Sailor Moon mania in Japan, a fighting game exclusively populated with female fighters, often lightly dressed, was released. This aspect is probably the main attraction of Pretty Fighter compared to its competitors. The game, with passable graphics, is however plagued by poor animation and imprecise gameplay, making the fights unexciting. Although Natsuki Crisis Battle shares some of these flaws, it stands out with more interesting and subtle gameplay, but also with a more elaborate universe and characters. Not to mention its more complete game modes. The verdict is clear: Natsuki Crisis Battle offers a richer and more polished experience compared to Pretty Fighter.
Wins!
Although it's unlikely to concern you directly, Natsuki Crisis Battle primarily targets fans of the O from which it is derived, its fidelity to the original being remarkable. Like Super Butoden, whose flaws were eventually ignored by DBZ fans. For the rest, Natsuki Crisis Battle presents itself as an ordinary fighting game, with just passable realization and gameplay that's more interesting than it appears, but not brilliant. Ultimately, what really distinguishes it from the multitude of fighting games on the Super Famicom is the originality of its universe and characters. It's up to you.